some issues that are specific to the league events. And we'll talk about the role of the referee. I'll give you some pointers on how to prepare so that you understand the rules and the process, and also some things we recommend you bring to the event just so that you have the best possible experience. Then we'll go through in detail sort of the process that a ref goes through to officiate an event. And then finally we'll go through this year's rules, and we'll try to blast through those as quickly as possible and talk about some of the subtler issues. So first off, I believe everybody here is either a referee volunteer or a league coordinator that wants to train to be a referee in case something crazy happens. And all of you should receive a link after the webinar tonight that'll give you a page where you can enter your availability. So I think we still haven't quite got all of the events scheduled. There's a bunch of, should we do this Friday or Saturday kind of questions. So if you can just follow that link and then type in your name and indicate your availability for each of the possible dates. And if you haven't used Doodle before, there's 3 options. You can say, yes, I'm available, no, I'm not available, and then there's an if needed, which they mark as a yes in parentheses. And that means, you could make that date work, but it's not awesome for your schedule. So, and we'll try to schedule things so that, people get good days for when they'll be asked to be referees. So, in basic terms, the role of the referee at an FTC match is obviously to observe matches, to identify rule violations, to make calls for those rule violations, to score the matches, and really that means just mark on a sheet of paper, where the scoring pieces ended up, and we'll have software that'll actually compute the score, so you don't have to know all of the how many points is that worth questions. And we're also there to inspire the teams. And unlike refs for most sporting events, we're there to help the teams improve their performance, to learn the game better and to do better in matches. In fact, that's why we're doing the league events, is to give teams basically 3 opportunities to play a small number of matches and make incremental improvements to the robots. We think this is going to be a really powerful program, and even more so than normal, it's important for the refs to help teams have a better experience and perform better. So to prepare to be a ref, you should read the rules, and there's also a Q&A forum for FTC that has a bunch of rulings on sort of fine points of the questions, and there's a bunch of useful clarifications there. And then after you've read that stuff, you'll want to take the FIRSTWA ref test, and I'll send a piece of email to everyone that I know about from either if you're on this webinar, if you're already on my ref list, I'll send you a piece of email that'll have a personalized link that'll let you take the ref test. And I'd also recommend printing out the rules reference card and taking that to the event with you. And at the bottom of the page there's a link to our resources page for FIRSTWA FTC referees. And I'll email that. I've probably already emailed that link to you 2 or 3 times, and I'll do it again so you don't have to copy it down out of this slide. Just a quick word on the test. I wrote that to be as painless as possible, and it gives you feedback if you don't get a question right, it gives you another opportunity to answer it. And we made it so that in order to get it past the test, you have to get them all right. And that's kind of a feature from my point of view. I've taken a bunch of ref tests from FIRST, and I get kind of annoyed when it says, oh yeah, you missed a question, but you got enough points that you pass. And I'm like, but I want to know what the right answer is. So anyway, with this test, it'll give you enough help that it shouldn't be difficult to answer all the questions. I hope there are no questions that people think are trick questions. And hopefully it'll be a learning experience as well as making sure that you understand the stuff. So what to bring to the event, everybody that's working in the field needs to have safety glasses. So that means, and actually there's a rule that defines what that means, so we'll talk about that later. I also recommend that you bring a clipboard and pen In fact, you might want to bring a couple if you're the head ref. Hopefully the league organizers will bring clipboards for us, but it's good to be prepared. You'll also want to bring a blank copy of the score sheet so that you can make copies of that if you have to. And I'd also recommend talking to your league organizer and making sure that they're set up to supply you with a printer. And if for some reason they can't do that, then you want to maybe print, say, 18 copies of the score sheet and take them with you to the event. I'd also recommend bringing the FTC game, the field setup, and the FCS setup documents, just in case, not only so that you have them there to reference as a referee, but if there's an issue with the FTA showing up or something and you have to set up the software, you've got the documents you need to do that. I wouldn't recommend, I'm not saying you should study all that stuff and memorize it, but you should have it with you in case you need to do a little on-the-fly training. Kathy and I have also prepared a rules reference card, which after you've read the rules will hopefully be a very effective reminder of what the rules are and what the associated penalties are. So I've found that to be a pretty handy tool the last couple of years I've refed. And there's some more things that we recommend you bring, like a water bottle, and those are also listed on that resource page that I'll send you a link for. So how to referee, I'll talk about several things. The start of the event, some issues with getting the match schedule, how to set it for each match, and then I'll walk through the anatomy of a match so that you'll know what you need to do at each of the different stages as you march through each match. So at the start of the event, I recommend that you meet with all the refs at the event. Hopefully there'll be a couple of you. Go over the rules, talk about any questions, bring an extra copy of the summary card to give the other ref so that you both have that. You'll want to check on the field setup, make sure that's going well, and if they have any questions, you'll have the documents on how to set that up. I'm guessing that'll go pretty well, but still it's a good idea to make sure. We're doing a lot more events than we've ever done in the past, so there might be some interesting issues. Also, before things get going, we want to set up a ref question box. So this is a place where if a student has a question about the scoring or the rules or some penalty, then they're supposed to go stand in this box, and then you talk to them when you can. So we want to set that area up and let people know about it. Also, you'll want to either print or otherwise create a team list, just a sheet of paper that's got all the team numbers on it, so that you can record penalties. So there are a number of penalties where, the first time they do it, they get a warning, and then the second time they do it, maybe they get a penalty, and if they keep doing it, then they get a harsher penalty like being disqualified. So we want to keep track of what teams have been warned about which penalties. I don't expect that's going to be a big deal, but I think it's important to be prepared to be able to do that. And also on that sheet of paper, if you find examples of gracious professionalism where teams are really, getting in the spirit of being both gracious and professional, write down those notes so that you can communicate those to the judges when we get to the division finals. That'll help the judging panel. So there's no judging at the league events, but there is when we get to the division championship, and I'm sure the judges will appreciate having that feedback. And that goes both ways. If you see particularly poor examples of people behaving badly, then let's make a note of that and make sure the judges know about that also. So regarding the match schedule, we expect to have between 10 and 12 teams at each of the league events, and they'll each play 6 rounds, which works out to be about 18 matches. We recommend that we set up the schedule so that there's 7 minutes between matches. We think that'll be enough time. It'll be almost 5 minutes between the end of one match and the start of the next one, so that should give people time to cycle. And obviously if you make that time short enough, then teams won't have enough time to get ready and get set up. And if you make it longer, that just makes the day longer. And I think 7 minutes is the right time. Now, also because we have so few teams, it's probably not going to be possible to set up schedules that avoid having teams play in back-to-back matches. So that's going to happen. Hopefully it won't happen a lot, but teams need to be prepared for that. And now we're not allowing team timeouts, because if we had teams doing a timeout, we'd have 12 teams and 12 timeouts, then that's a whole lot of time that we don't want to spend. So rather than allowing timeouts, even though we're potentially scheduling back-to-back match appearances, we want to set up the schedule so that there's a 15-minute break after every 2 rounds. So basically we'll have every team play 2 matches, and then we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll get every team to where they've played 4 matches, and then do another 15-minute break, and then play the last 2 rounds for everyone. Yeah. And there's some talk of going to 8-minute match scheduling, I'm told. So we'll let you know what the final decision on that is. So once you've got that schedule, if you haven't done it already, you'll want to print out the score sheets. And there are instructions on our favorite resource page that tells you how to use the data that comes out of the scoring software to use whatever Word calls it, print merge, to create pre-printed score sheets that have the match number, the time that the match was scheduled, and the teams. I've been doing that for a couple of years, and I find it really handy to have that right there on the score sheet, so I can check and make sure that we've got the right teams on the field. So, but if you don't want to hassle with the instructions for doing that, you can just print them out and fill them out for each match. So the scorekeeper presents a challenge for these league events. I'm not sure we're going to have enough trained scorekeepers that will have someone dedicated to that role at each match. So there may not be a scorekeeper at your event, so that hopefully we'll have the FTA will generate the schedule, and then either the FTA or the head ref or that second ref will enter the scores when we get a break. And I got slightly out of order here. The scorekeeper software generates the match schedule, and it's possible to have it dump out a file that you can extract that match schedule and use it to do the mail merge thing. And again, there are instructions for that on the resources page. Doing the trick that we want to do, where we want to schedule matches, requires filling in some kind of finicky numbers in the scorekeeper software. So Kathy's built an Excel spreadsheet that's on the now famous resource page, where you just type in the number of teams and the starting time, and it will dump out the values that you need to enter into the scorekeeper software to generate a schedule with the times for the matches all being correct. And at the end of the day, we want to have either the head ref or the league coordinator keep those score sheets. Those are sort of definitive copies of what happened in case something crazy happens with the software. For some reason we need to go back and re-enter scores or investigate an error or something. We need to have those originals. So one of those 2 people should keep the sheets, and I maybe recommend that the other person use their cell phone to take photos of all of those sheets, just so we have a couple of copies, because that's obviously super important. Optionally, if you've got a laptop that you're willing to bring to the event, then it would be nice to bring a Windows laptop, and I'm told that it's best that that laptop be running Windows XP in order to run with software that FIRST supplies that we need to run a match. So if you can do that, great. If you can't, that's okay too. Here's a picture of the field. I hope everybody's seen this by now, but I'll just say a few things. You can see it's a square field. There's a red side and a blue side. In the middle of each of the perimeter edges, there are 2 ring dispensers. Each one has 6 rings on it. And you can see that there's, like in the red half, in the lower right half of that field, there's a red dispenser and a blue dispenser, and there's some rules about those we'll talk about. In the middle of the field is what they call the rack and the scoring pegs, and so the teams are going to want to put their rings on those scoring pegs. And also, hopefully it's clear enough. You can see in the scoring pegs that are closest to our point of view, there's something dangling from that middle peg, and that's an IR beacon. It's an infrared beacon that sends out an infrared light that the robots can use to identify that position, and they get some bonus points, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then just to the side of the two far edges, there are boxes. Those are the alliance boxes, and that's where all of the team members the drive team has to stand during the match. They have to stay inside that box. And then there are two corner goals. Those are the things with little flags on it, and the teams also want to put rings on those goals. We'll talk about that later too. So that's an overview of what the field looks like. So before we start the matches, ideally we'll have the head ref lead a quick drivers meeting where the ref will emphasize key rules and penalties, etc., and also explain the match flow to the teams. So we'll have an on-deck cue where the teams that are going to play the next match should get all lined up before, while the previous match is going on, and then talk to them about what they need to do when they set up for the match, and then what they need to do during field reset. Namely, once the ref says that the field is clear, then they'll need to work with the field reset team to get their robots off the field. So we don't allow the student members to get onto the field, and so typically if they can't reach it from the edge of the field, then a field reset person will hand them the robot. So we just want to keep the field from getting beat up with a bunch of people stomping around on it. And then you also want to explain the conference box where they need to go stand if they have questions for the referee about the match. And if they want to ask questions, they have to do it within 2 matches, and there should be one student, at most one student per team, to come and talk to the ref. So we're not allowed to, or we don't allow the students to, gang up on the ref with a whole bunch of team members, and under no circumstances an adult allowed to question the ref about a ruling or a scoring or anything. So it's just one student representative from each team, and if anybody else shows up in that box, just tell them they can't be there, shoo them away, and don't talk to anyone until they comply with that. Okay, to get set up for each match, each team is allowed to bring up to 2 student drivers and 1 coach, and the league organizer should provide buttons that, stickers that will can be worn to identify the 2 student drivers and the coach. And it's important to be able to tell which one's the coach, because that person is not allowed to touch the controls. Before the match starts, you want to clear everyone else away from the field. The league events are going to be fairly informal. It's probably we're going to be in the lunchroom or whatever. And so I think we just need to get people to back up away from the field enough that the refs can easily move around the field to change their point of view so that they're watching the things that need to be watched. So I hope people will be pretty cooperative with that, but definitely that's a case where the head ref needs to be a little assertive to get the field clear. Then you'll want to check the field elements, make sure all those ring dispensers are loaded up the way they're supposed to be. And you want to check the robot positions. Later we'll talk about what the exact rules are for positioning the robots. And you also want to check and make sure that all of the robots have team numbers that are visible. They should have team numbers on the robot in large contrasting colored numbers that, 2 signs, one, separated by 180 degrees, so that you can easily identify which robot is, doing the good thing or the bad thing that you need to record. And then you also want to check the autonomous ring placement. We'll talk about the specific rule there, but basically each team can have one special autonomous ring that's touching it or held by it that's ready to go at the beginning of autonomous. Then once all the robots are set up and the team members are all in place, then you need to place the infrared beacons, and we've got a slide about some details on that. And then once you're ready to go, everything's all set up, then signal the FTA to start the match. So to set up the IR beacons, once the robots are placed, before starting the match, you'll place the IR beacons. I believe it's the the FTA, the software that the FTA is running, I'm sorry, it's the scorekeeper software, will randomly pick one of the 3 columns where you should place the IR beacons. And you'll place it on both sides of the same column, and then the columns are labeled A, B, and C, where A is the one on the audience side. So in that photo I showed you a few minutes ago, that was the side that was closest to us. And so that's A, the middle one's B, and then the one that's typically closest to where the FTA is sitting is C. But just remember A is for audience. And so you place those columns, and once that's been revealed, either by you placing the column or by the FTA or scorekeeper shouting it across the room, the teams are not allowed to touch their robots or the controls. And if they break that, then we've got a rule for it. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, during the autonomous period, the drivers are still not allowed to touch the controls. The drivers and the coach have to stay in the alliance box. Pinning is not called during autonomous. We'll talk about pinning. Basically, that's where one robot jams into another and keeps it from moving. And there's no penalty for that during autonomous, but if somebody's in a pinning position at the end of autonomous, then they have to, the first action they do once the driver controlled period starts is they have to get out of that position. Other penalties can happen, like if you have a robot that touches the opposing alliance's ring dispenser, that's a penalty, but I suspect those will be pretty rare, but we do need to watch for them. At the end of autonomous, we have to do several things. We have to remove any autonomous rings that are in contact with robots of the corresponding alliance. So if you have a red autonomous ring in contact with a red robot, it has to be removed. And that's particularly important if they've, say, put that ring on the rack, on one of the pegs on the rack, but they haven't completely released it, or for any reason they're still touching it, then we need to remove that ring so that it doesn't count, it doesn't get scored, and we just need to get it off the field. And that's true of any autonomous ring that's touching a robot of the same color. Now, if there's an autonomous ring that's just laying on the floor, that's fine. They don't count for scoring, but anything touching a robot has to be removed. At that point, we can record the positions of any remaining autonomous rings, and sometimes it's easy to forget to do this. So this year, I'm going to be in the habit of crossing out any autonomous rings that didn't get placed, and that'll just remind me to always fill out that section of the score sheet at the end of autonomous, so I don't miss things. Next, if there are any robots that got tangled up during autonomous, lots of crazy things can happen during autonomous. The head ref should carefully untangle them. Likewise, if a robot is tipped over so that it's not on its drivetrain, so that it can't move, then again, we should ask the team, hey, where can I grab your robot, and then do so and put it on its drivetrain, put it on its wheel so that it can start moving. And then once that's all, any of those issues are squared away, then signal the FTA to start the driver control period. Now, I suspect, especially the first week of league events, there's not going to be a lot of scoring during autonomous, and hopefully we won't have too many robots falling over. So hopefully, for the most part, you'll just take a quick look at the field and to cross out those autonomous rings for not getting scored, and then give the FTA the thumbs up to go ahead and start the driver control period. So the driver control period, if you've got 2 refs on the field, I'd recommend dividing it so that you've got one ref watching the red side and one ref watching the blue side, because it'll be hard to watch the whole field all at once. Or if you try to divide, say, have one ref watch the red robots, the other watch the blue, and they get on opposite sides of the field, it'll be hard to watch. So I recommend dividing the field in half. And obviously you want to watch for and note any penalties. And there's a huge penalty for descoring things. So if there's a ring on a peg and a robot removes that, there's a gigantic penalty for doing that. So it really shouldn't happen, but we need to be prepared that if there's a ring that got scored and then somebody descores it, we have to remember where that was and record it at the end of the match, because the descoring it, shouldn't have happened. So I mean, it's impossible. It's against the rules to descore, so that ring still counts even if it does get yanked off by another robot. So there was some head ref training session a couple weeks ago that was super helpful, and one of the things I got out of that was a recommendation for the top 6 things to watch for, particularly during that driver-controlled period. So number 1 is pinning, and we'll talk about the rules and what defines pinning. But again, it's basically jamming into another robot so that it can't move. Also, it's against the rules to contact the opposing alliances, the rings on their dispenser, so we have to keep a close eye out for that. A robot can only possess 2 rings at a time, so we need to watch for instances where they're carrying more than they're allowed. And again, there's a definition of what constitutes possession that we'll get to later. We also want to watch for game pieces going out of bounds, and if that happens, either a ref or someone from the field reset crew should return that ring back into the field as close to where it left the field as possible, and do that, as quickly as is safe and reasonable. And obviously, if it gets dropped, in one of the alliance boxes, it might be underfoot of the drivers, so we'll have to exercise a little caution there and not trip up a driver or anything, but do things as quickly as we can safely. We also need to watch, there's a nice bonus if one robot can lift another, but that's not allowed to happen until the end game, which is the last 30 seconds of the driver-controlled period. And if a robot starts lifting another robot before the end game, then we need to make note of that because it disqualifies them from getting the lifting bonus. No matter what happens later, if you start a lift early, you can't get the lifting bonus. Okay, so I've got a question. I'll get to that in just a moment. And then during the end game, there's protection rules that keep, if one robot is in the process of lifting another, then it's very, very against the rules to interfere them for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so Kathy has a question for me. Yeah, so Beth asks if during autonomous a team realizes that they didn't plug in their battery or something, forgot to turn on their brick, are we allowed to let them touch their robot to get it working and for the rest of the match? That's a good question, and I think I'll recommend that that's sort of at the discretion of the FTA. It may or may not work with the FTA software, robot logging in at that point. So I would talk to the FTA about that, and in a situation where the FTA says it's okay, then sure, go ahead. It'd probably be best to have the ref do it rather than getting a student involved in the field, and maybe that'll be if that doesn't work out, then it's a good lesson learned that they really, really need to double check and make sure their robot is ready to operate before that autonomous period begins. Yeah. So there's a question about the protection for lifting only occurs if you're in the alliance field. Yeah, and I'll give you the whole rule. There's like 3 conditions that have to apply for that to happen, and we'll talk about that later. Okay. So okay. I think Kathy's going to unmute Richard. Have I answered your question? Are you there, Richard? Yeah, I'm not hearing anything, so let's okay, cool. He doesn't have a mic, so we'll get to it later. Great. So at the end of the match, now maybe we have some work to do. The first thing we want to do is record the scoring elements and the lift heights on the score sheet. one thing to keep in mind is that both the rack and the corner goals are alliance neutral, meaning either team can score on either side of the rack and either corner goal. So it doesn't matter, which of those the teams use. Also record any penalties. And now, partly because we may not have a dedicated scorekeeper that's going to be able to keep up with entering the scores, as the matches happen. That means that the teams aren't going to have an opportunity to see a mistake. I mean, if we make a mistake in scoring, they're not going to have a chance to see it in a timely fashion. So what we're going to do to solve that problem is at the end of the match, we want to have one representative from each alliance to come and look at the score sheet as the head ref has filled it out, and then initial it to indicate that they agree that the scoring positions of all the scoring pieces has been recorded correctly. And then that way, if there's a dispute later, we can go back to that paper copy. It's now definitive. It's been submitted by the head ref, and it's been signed by the two alliances. So there's really nothing to contest at that point. And so that'll make sure that everything stays square through the whole process here. As soon as you're done with the field, signal for field reset. That'll let the FTA know that he can set up for the next match, and also the people that are putting the game pieces back and the teams removing the robots. We got to keep that going as fast as we can so that we're staying on schedules with the matches. At most events, I would say your next step is to give the score sheet to the scorekeeper. Since we may not have a dedicated scorekeeper, we just need to do something with it. So if you've got a clipboard, you can just move it to the bottom of your stack on your clipboard, or maybe give it to the FTA. But again, we need to make sure that we keep those sheets safe and secure. So yeah, do something appropriate for your event. At that point, if teams incurred any penalties during the match, I would try to track them down as quickly as possible and make sure they understand what penalty they violated, and so that they learn and don't do it again. And we have another question.
Yeah, somebody asked if the team doesn't agree with the scoring on the score sheet, do you talk to them about it then or in the question months? And I think you recognize the situation.
Yeah, so if somebody has a problem with the scoring sheet before they sign, we want to get that straightened out before we have the field reset. And ultimately, the head ref is the final authority. So if there's a disagreement on how something is interpreted or scored, even if they don't agree with you, the head ref gets to make the final choice, and then their signature on the paper just means that they understand what the head ref did. So we're not giving authority to the students to tell you how to score. We're just making sure that they understand what you've written on the sheet. And I suspect that probably all the time, once you've looked at it together, everything's going to be straight. We just want to make sure that the refs don't make a mistake or leave something out, which is a problem I've had a few times, and it's really embarrassing, and we want to keep that to a bare minimum. Finally, at the end, you want to just make sure that there are no students standing in the ref question box to deal with. So this is what the score sheet looks like. I don't want to go over it in a lot of detail, but anyway, here it is, and you can download it from the infamous resources page. And at the end, if you have any questions, we can come back and talk about this. But let's keep going. So now there's this idea of escalating penalties, which are called out fairly well in the rules, but there are some places that are not incredibly clear. So there's rules that'll say something like doing this bad thing will result in a penalty or disqualification. In these cases, the penalties are escalating, perhaps from a warning the first time to a penalty the second time, and then to disqualification from the match or even the event for repeated or blatant disregard for the rule. And we've taken the information from the rules and from the head ref training we got from FIRST a few weeks ago, and summarized that on the rule card, on that rules reference card that's available on the resource page. And so for each each of the rules that has a progression like that, an escalation, it'll tell you, oh yeah, give them a warning the first time. On the second time, they get a major penalty, and then the third time they get disqualification. Or on another one, it might be, well, they get a major penalty the first time, and then get disqualified for repeated instances. So anyway, that rules reference card will be pretty handy. It's a good summary. So now I want to start out with the tournament rules, which are in section 1 of the FTC game document. Let's see, so tournament rule T1 basically says that referees, the head referee namely, has ultimate gameplay and scoring authority during the competition. Their rulings are final. So if you have a student that argues with you, I mean, they're welcome to make their case, but once you've made your decision, then it's final. They can't keep arguing with you. They can't escalate it to the league coordinator or send email to Kevin Ross, because those people just tell them that your decision is final. So it's important for you to know that, and that's how you can end a controversy if you have to. Ideally, we want everybody to be happy, but you know, if it comes down to a difference of opinion, there's only one opinion that matters in the end. Another important point is referees are not allowed to look at any video recordings or photos taken of matches. It doesn't matter who took it, whether it was a team member or a parent or somebody in the field reset crew, it doesn't matter. We don't look at photos. If the ref didn't see it, then it didn't happen. And again, we do this because we want to keep the time flowing well. You know, people should understand that refs are human and we might make a mistake from time to time, and if that happens, then that's unfortunate, but we're not going to go review video or look at photos. You know, the flip side of that is, I mean, this happened a few times where I neglected to record some, you know, scoring element or something, and a student will say, hey, how come I didn't get the points for, you know, putting that ring over there? And then I'll talk to the other ref and say, did you see this? And if that person, if we can confirm somebody on the ref crew that saw it and they scored it, then we fix it. But if not, if we don't have verification from, you know, a ref seeing it, then it doesn't get recorded. So we want to keep mistakes obviously down to a minimum. But you know, again, whatever the refs see and whatever the head ref rules, that's the final truth. If students have a ref or a question for a ref about a ruling or a score or a penalty, then they need to go wait in the ref question box, and they have to do that within 2 matches. That doesn't mean you need to deal with it within 2 matches. So once you've recognized the students there, you want to keep the match schedule rolling, and then, you know, talk to them between matches or whatever. So don't let yourself get stuck in an argument, a continuing argument with the student, and throw the schedule out of whack. So yeah, you need to manage your time and assert your authority to keep things moving well. And teams are only allowed access to the field to place their robots and to remove their robots. They shouldn't be, you know, jumping into the field so they can go look at the scoring rings or, you know, doing anything else. So that's the only thing they're allowed to do is place and remove their robots. T2 says that there are 3 team representatives, with a little typo there, on the field, 2 student drivers and 1 coach identified by badges, and only the 2 student drivers can operate the robot. T3, there are no timeouts allowed during the qualifying matches. Now, I mentioned this earlier. At the league events, we may have teams playing back-to-back matches. And even though that may put a team in a position where their robot gets broken in match 3 and they have to then play in match 4, they don't get a timeout, and that's unfortunate, but it's part of the game. Now, to sort of mitigate that, that's why we're building in those 2 15-minute breaks. So that if you get if your robot gets broken during round 3, you might be forced to play your round 4 match with a broken robot, but then you'll get a break between rounds 4 and 5. And there's some weird exceptions. If we have a an odd number of teams, then you might have to play, there will be a couple of teams that will have to play 3 matches before the first break. And, again, that's just part of the game, part of the compromise that we make in order to be able to have so much more experience going into being able to play 3 weekends of matches before that championship. That's going to make teams a lot better prepared. So they just need to understand that there's a trade-off in terms of being able to get all of this playing time, but keeping the time length of the events manageable. So no timeouts, just those 2 breaks in the middle of the rounds. Right. Tournament Rule 4 says that teams are guaranteed 5 minutes between matches. Now, normally that happens automatically if you're not in back-to-back matches. So if you're in match 3 and then you don't have to play again until match number 5, then you definitely get 5 minutes. But if a team is scheduled in back-to-back matches, it's possible with the 7-minute schedule that they may not have that full 5 minutes. Now, if somebody really needs it, if they have some compelling reason, then we'll allow them a little extra time. But in general, we want to push that schedule so that we can stay on that 7 or 8-minute match schedule. It'll be challenging, but we need teams to be quick and understanding about needing to get through the schedule quickly. T5 says that each alliance is allowed 1 timeout during elimination matches, but there are no elimination matches during the league events. Those will only be qualifying matches, so we won't have to worry about that until we get to the division championships. Everyone has to wear safety glasses or prescription glasses, which have polycarbonate lenses with safety-approved side shield. So, bring safety glasses. Take care of yourself, definitely. So let's talk about some of the general robot rules. RGO1 says that each team's only allowed 1 competition robot at each event, so they can't switch back and forth between 2 robots. So it's pretty straightforward. RG2 says that each robot must pass inspection before it's allowed to complete. If it gets significantly altered during the event, it needs to be re-inspected. A team that refuses to be inspected or be re-inspected when told to do so by the head ref, or they get disqualified. So we don't put up with that. The league events will be doing a peer inspection, and so that means we'll have teams inspecting each other's robots. I hope that every team has, or every event has, at least 1 experienced team that'll help the others do the inspection. And if there's any controversy about that, the head ref may be called to come in and make a ruling. I'm not recommending that you thoroughly study all of the robot inspection rules, but you should have a printout of them, and you should be prepared to read whatever rule is under controversy and make your ruling. And again, the head ref rules are final, so get in there and do your best to be fair and consistent. RGO 5 says that the robot main power switch must be mounted and positioned to be readily accessible and visible to competition personnel. So this is an important rule, because if a robot runs amok, we need to be able to shut it down before it damages the field or other robots. So when the team set up their robots on the field, you should just take a quick look and make sure you see where their power switches are. And ask the team if you don't see where their power switch is. RGO8, I skipped a couple. Anyway, RGO8 says that robots must have a flag holder specified in the rules. So basically they have to have a way that they hold the alliance flag that indicates whether they're a red robot or a blue robot in a way that stays clearly visible throughout the match. They must also prominently display the team number, and that is just the number, not the name. It has to be visible from 2 sides. They have to be, there's a size that's specified in the rules. I didn't write it down, but it has to be big enough and contrasty enough that you can easily see it from across the field. And this is frequently an issue with teams. I tend to, if a team shows up with either a missing sign or an unreadable sign, I'll generally give them a warning the first time, but if they show up a second time, then I'll disqualify them for that match and make them fix it and get re-inspected before they can play again. It's usually not a big problem once you explain to them that it's important and yes, you really are going to require it. There's a bunch of other RG rules. I recommend that you read them and being aware of them so that you can reference them during the day if you have to. There's a whole bunch of rules on robot parts and the materials and the software rules. Again, you should have a little bit of familiarity of sort of the basic gist of what's going on there, but that's not something you need to thoroughly understand or memorize in advance. But bring a copy of it to the event and reference it as needed if you have to settle an inspection dispute. So let's start getting into the gameplay. So in the document, section 1.3.1 talks about things you need to do before the match. So when the robot's placed on the field, each robot has to touch exactly one field wall. It may not touch the ring dispenser or the rings on the dispenser for either dispenser, theirs or the opponent's. It must be completely within their half of the field, so you can't have a part hanging over onto the other side of the field. It's allowed to be in contact with exactly one autonomous ring, so either 0 rings or 1 ring. It's not allowed to be in contact with more than 1 ring. And once you've seen that all of that stuff has been satisfied, then the head ref will go ahead and ask the scorekeeper for which column to place the beacon on, and again you place that in the middle row on that column. Then during the autonomous period, the robots will try to place autonomous rings on the rack. At the end of that, we want to record any autonomous ring placements on the score sheet, and then the scorekeeper, whenever that gets entered into the scorekeeper software, that'll determine the points. So you don't have to know all of those. And if a student asks me, "Well, what was our score on that?" I say, "Sorry, I don't know." So we only record the positions, and it's up to the scorekeeper to determine the score. Once you've recorded the positions of those autonomous rings on the score sheet, then any autonomous rings that are in contact with robots of the same color have to be removed from the field, so the head ref will have to pop into the field and remove those rings. During the driver-controlled period, robots are going to be trying to score rings on the rack, possibly in the corner goals and the center floor goal. And it is very illegal to descore the rings from the rack or the corner goal. It's okay to push them around on the center floor goal, right, or off the center floor goal. I mean, if that weren't legal, then it would basically be impossible to get it to move a robot to the rack. So the things that are on that center floor area, those are fair game to be knocked around for any purpose. Section 1.3.4 describes the end game. It's the last 30 seconds of the driver-controlled period. The robots can lift an alliance robot during that period, and there is lifting protection, or lifting is protected from interference. And again, we'll get that rule in all of its gory detail here in a bit. Okay, so game restrictions. So game restriction 2, robots may possess no more than 2 rings at a time. There's a minor penalty for each ring over 2, and an additional minor penalty for every 5 seconds that the condition persists. So let's suppose that a robot is in possession of 3 rings for 7 seconds. It earns 1 penalty for having the 3rd ring, and then once they cross that 5-second mark, then they earn an additional penalty for having stayed in that condition for more than 5 seconds, and that repeats every 5 seconds. So, and also the other issue is if a robot's carrying more than 2 rings, then it can't score. If it puts a ring on a peg while it was carrying 3 rings, then that ring doesn't count. And again, you'll probably need to make a note on the score sheet to remind you, oh, don't count the red peg or the red ring that was put on, column A, the bottom row, because it was put there when they were carrying too many rings. Right, so definitely talk to the team about that after. And just a note on possession, what constitutes possession? Basically, if the robot is either carrying the ring or holding the ring, such that if the robot turns, the ring stays in approximately the same relative position, or the same position relative to the robot, and if it backs up and that ring stays in approximately the same position relative to the robot, then it's in possession. So that means if it's held by some sort of grabbing mechanism, it's in possession. One thing, or if it's right in a container, a bucket, or whatever. One thing that's different from the way this works, if people are familiar with FRC, one thing that's different here is suppose they have sort of a U-shaped plow on the front of their robot. If they can have as many rings as they want in there, because in that situation, if it's sort of a U-shaped plow, if they rotate, those rings might stay in approximately the same relative position. But if they back up, then the rings won't follow them. So that does not count as possession. So if you're familiar with FRC terms, it's okay to herd rings, but it's not okay to actually grasp or contain more than 2 rings. Game restriction 3, robots may not make contact with a ring on an opposing alliance's, may not make contact with an opposing alliance's ring while that ring is in contact with the opposing alliance's ring dispenser. So those are the little horizontal pegs that are on the center of each of the 4 perimeter walls of the field. And a blue robot cannot touch a red ring that's in contact with the red dispenser. That's a gigantic penalty. It's a major penalty. It's 50 points. And there's been a question that's circulated around. So here's the scenario. Suppose a blue robot goes over to the red dispenser, and the red dispenser has 6 rings on it. And the blue robot very carefully reaches up behind the backmost ring and then pushes that ring forward and knocks all the rings off of the dispenser. How many penalties does it get? Now, if you read the rules as originally stated, it said you'd say, oh, it only touched 1 ring, so it only gets 1 penalty. But the game committee has clarified that in Q&A number 20, and it says if you do something like that, if you sweep multiple rings off of the dispenser, then you get a penalty not only for every ring you touched, but also for every ring that came off of that dispenser. So that's an important thing. It's very forbidden. Do not mess around with the opposing alliance's ring dispensers, or you will incur gigantic penalties. Game restriction 5, robots are not allowed to intentionally remove rings from the playing field. Now, it might happen that, whatever, a robot accidentally flings a ring or it falls off of an arm or something and falls out of the field. That's okay. But if they're intentionally removing the rings from the playing field, then they get a set of escalating penalties. They get a minor penalty, not a warning. The first time, if you determine that they're doing it intentionally, then they get a minor penalty the first time, and then they get disqualified from the match if they continue to do that. So don't do that. Game restriction 6, robots may not descore rings belonging to either alliance from the corner goals or from the rack. And this is a double major penalty. It's 100 points. That's probably as many points as a robot's likely to make in a match, so that's gigantic. Don't do that. And that applies to your rings as well as the opposing alliance rings. So if a team decides, oh, I want to move that peg up from the middle row to the top row, they can't do that. And if they pull that ring off so that they can put it somewhere else, first off, we score that ring where it was originally. We don't score it where they moved it to, and they get a 100-point penalty. Again, it's okay to push rings around on the center floor goal, and that doesn't incur any penalty. Game restriction 7 says that at the end of autonomous, the head ref removes any autonomous rings in contact with the robot of the corresponding alliance, and the ref records the position of any remaining rings after those rings in contact with the robots are removed. Game restriction 8. Robots are not allowed to interfere with opposing robots in the process of lifting. So here's the big rule and all the details. This rule only applies during the end game, during the last 30 seconds of the driver-controlled period. It only applies if both of the opposing robots are on their side of the field, so that means two red robots have to be on the red side of the field in order to be protected for lifting. And then the last condition is that the lifting is started, that one robot is at least partially supported by the other. So for example, if we have a red robot that has some sort of a ramp that it drops down, and then for the other robot to drive up onto that ramp, and then they lift the ramp up, as soon as that other red robot has moved a wheel onto that ramp so that part of that robot is supported by the lifting robot, now they have protection. And it is gigantically illegal to then touch or in any way interfere with those two robots. So that's a triple major penalty, 150 points. It's very, very huge. Now, what is allowed is that it is okay to play defense. If you've got two robots on the red side of the field and they're trying to get into position so that they can lift, a blue robot can get in between them and be a nuisance and keep them from getting together. But once the two red robots are in contact and one of them is at least partially supported, then you can't touch them. But before that happens, it is okay to run defense. So this is such an important rule, and it has such a big penalty, it's probably worth discussing why they put it in there. And they did that to encourage people to do lifting, which is a very difficult task. So there's a very nice reward for doing it, and there's a huge penalty for messing with robots that are capable of doing it. And we also, in addition to promoting a cool robot thing, if we have one robot that's being lifted by another, there's a lot of potential for damage. Potential for damage to the robot, to the field, to having a 40-pound robot fall on the floor of the field and cause damage there, and also fall off the field and land on, say, the head ref. We really don't want that to happen. So, once that lifting is started, just stay the heck away from those two robots, and we want to make sure teams are very clear on that. Game Restriction 9 says that robots lifting their alliance partner's robot before the end game begins will not be awarded the end game bonus. So that means if a red robot starts to lift its partner before the end game starts, then that alliance is now completely disqualified from getting a lifting bonus. So it doesn't matter if they set the robot back down and then lift it again later completely during to the end game. If they start a lift before the end game, then they lose the opportunity to get that bonus for that match. Game Rule 10, teams are not allowed to touch their robots or the controllers after the IR beacons are placed. If that happens, then they get a minor penalty, and the robot that belongs to the team that violated the rule its Tom's ring won't be scored. Okay, game rules. So safety rule S1, this is sort of our blanket rule. Basically says if the head ref thinks that a robot's operation is unsafe or has damaged another robot or the field doing some unsafe thing, then that robot may be disabled and the team disqualified and required to be re-inspected. So this rule doesn't happen a lot, but if you've got a robot that's out of control and doing something reckless, then this is the rule that you use to shut them down and get them to stop doing that. Safety Rule 2 says that if any part of a robot makes contact with anything outside the field perimeter, it will be disabled. So it's okay if a robot has an arm and it reaches up over the perimeter wall and extends, slightly outside of the perimeter, as long as it's not, presenting any sort of safety concern, that's fine. But the moment it touches, say, even the top edge of the perimeter wall, the outside of the perimeter wall, or the floor, or anything outside of the field, one of the players, for example, then it gets disabled. And then one note on that is that if a robot's actively working on getting a ring off of its dispenser or trying to score a ring onto a corner goal, then we want to allow them some latitude. It's pretty hard to maneuver in those areas without maybe having an arm go a little bit out of the field. So in that circumstance, if they touch the top of the perimeter wall and things are otherwise safe, then we're not going to call this penalty on that in those two areas. But again, the head ref has to make a decision as to whether that action is safe. If it's just a little, inadvertent excursion outside the field in the process of doing an important part of the game, it's okay in those two areas. So then Rule G1 says that each robot has to start within the volume of an 18-inch cube, so they can't have any of their arms sticking out before the match starts. If a robot violates that, they may be disabled at the head ref's discretion. And also, any sort of alignment devices that aren't part of the robot can't be used to position the robot. So I can't, use a laser pointer or use a meter stick or something to get a robot pointed at the specific column or peg that I want to go after. Now, if they've put some sort of, little sighting device that's actually built onto the robot and conforms to all the robot rules, they can use that, but they can't use any external device or any device that would be illegal to have on the robot. G2 says that the drive team consists of 2 student drivers and 1 coach, and that electronic communication devices cannot be used once a drive team is called to the field. So we can't have a coach having a cell phone conversation with somebody in the audience that maybe has a better view of what's going on. So yeah, no cell phones or walkie-talkies or anything like that once they've been called to the field for a match. So G3 says that during a match, the drivers and the coach must remain in the alliance station. This is one that has escalating penalties. We start with a warning. If they do it again, then they get a penalty, and if they keep doing it repeatedly, they get disqualified that. In my experience, occasionally a student will break this rule. It's actually pretty rare. The biggest offense is when you have the coach, particularly, say, an adult that's there with their video camera taping the match, then they're not watching where their feet is, and they step outside of the box, and we need to keep an eye on that and make sure they're not doing that. It's not only against the rules, it's unsafe. Now, there's an exemption for this rule. If something goes flying off the field and the drivers need to scatter to avoid being, whacked or impaled, then there's obviously no penalty for taking care of safety issues, getting out of the way of projectiles. Rule G4 says that drivers and coaches are prohibited from making contact with the playing field or the game elements. Again, escalating penalties, a warning for the first time, penalty for a second time, and then disqualification if it persists. And any contact that affects scoring results in an immediate disqualification for that team. So if somebody reaches over and tweaks a ring that wasn't quite in position, or pops a ring off of their robot so they're not violating the can't carry more than 2 rule, then the consequences for that are immediate and harsh. Rule G5, coaches are not allowed to touch the controls or otherwise operate the robot during a match. Again, escalating penalties, they get a warning, then they get a penalty, then they get a disqualification. And that is a major penalty, so a 50-point penalty. Again, you don't see that very often, but that's why it's important that the stickers distinguish between the coach and the student. And really the intent of this rule is we don't want some perhaps domineering mentor to grab the controls out of the student's hands because he or she's frustrated with the student driver and taking over. So that's the most extreme case of violating this rule. But yeah, the coach is not allowed to even just reach over and push the button. Oh, your controller's in the wrong mode. Here, let me push that button for you. No, the coach is not allowed to do that. So, Rule G6 says that we wait until all objects come to rest at the end of a match. So I think in this game, there's probably not going to be much of an issue with the rings. Although if one gets tossed onto a peg during the last second of the match and is jiggling around, we wait for that to settle into its final resting position. It's probably more of an issue for lifting a robot. If a robot gets lifted and that drive, whatever mechanism that's lifting it up, isn't quite strong enough to hold it and it's slowly drifting down, we wait for it to come to a complete stop before we measure how high it's lifted. Rule G7, robots aren't allowed to deliberately detach parts during a match. Now, sure, parts will break and fall off all the time. That's fine as long as it doesn't affect gameplay. and this escalates in the way that you'd expect. We disable and disqualify for a first offense, and again, that's where they've intentionally detached a part in a strategic way that affects gameplay. So they get disabled and disqualified the first time, and then if they do it again, then they get disqualified from the competition. I don't think I've ever seen that rule get invoked during FTC. FRC, I think some years has had a little harsher thing where even incidental parts falling off would get you in trouble. But yeah, so I think teams generally know they're not supposed to do that. Rule G8 says that robots can't grab, grasp, grapple, or attach to any playing field element or structure other than scoring element. So you can't, grab onto the wall to help lift a robot or things like that. And again, we have the typical escalation of warning, major penalty, and then disqualification. So G9 says that strategies and mechanisms aimed solely at the destruction, damage, or tipping over or entanglement of robots are not in the spirit of the first tech challenge and are not allowed. So, there's going to be some mayhem occur during a pretty interactive robot competition. But any sort of deliberate damage or tipping is not allowed. So an example of, a borderline case of that is suppose there's a red robot that for whatever reason has lost its balance, it hit a bump and it's a little bit tilty. A blue robot can't come in and bump that robot and knock it over. That's intentional tipping. Even though the red robot sort of put itself in a precarious position, it's against the rules for the blue robot to exploit that and tip the robot over. Likewise, if a robot has dangling wires or whatever in a way that are making entanglements happen, then that robot should be forced to fix the problem and be re-inspected. So if you're not sure if something was intentional, then definitely warn the team. But if you see repeated behavior or clearly intentional, blatant behavior of this sort, then disqualify the team for that match. So G10, the pinning penalty. This is another one that's a little complicated, sort of like the lifting penalty. So a pinning penalty is called if one robot does all of the three following things. They prevent an opposing robot from moving in all directions. And there's another typo on the slide. So what does that mean? So, well, fine. Let's finish talking, then I'll do some examples. And so they prevent a robot from moving in all directions while that opposing robot is in contact with a field element or another robot. So that means that robot's pinned against something else. And also that condition persists for 5 seconds. So let's talk about some kind of funny cases. Suppose a robot doesn't turn very well. It can only go forward and back. If, say, a red robot can really only go forward and back. It doesn't turn very well. A blue robot can camp in front of that robot and prevent it from moving. That's totally legal. If it's in a position where if the robot could turn or could otherwise move sideways, it has a clear path to travel, then that's not pinning. So that's exploiting a weakness in the robot's design.
If a robot can only go forward and back and you block both forward and back, it is pinned.
There's a little controversy on that point. I'm
sure.
Kathy says she's sure. We'll have a discussion, and I'll get back to that. So Kathy's almost always right in these situations, so let's say that she's right. If you've prevented a robot so that it can't move, regardless of if its drive is limited only to forward and back, then and it's up against another field element or another robot, and that condition persists for 5 seconds, then that robot, the pinning robot, has earned a penalty. Now, as soon as a robot's in that position, it created that circumstance, so where it's pressed up against a robot that's up against the wall or whatever, then the refs need to signal that condition. And the way you do that is you point at the pinning robot, the offending robot, and then you very visibly count on your fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do a 5-second count, moving your arm up and down and extending another finger each time you do that and counting out 5 so that the teams have a warning that they're in that situation. Now, if while you're doing that count, then the pinning robot has to back up at least 3 feet, which is about 1.5 floor tiles, and stay 3 feet away for at least 3 seconds before moving back in to interfere with that other robot's motion. And the escalation on that is that first it's a minor penalty, and then we're supposed to disable the robot. We're supposed to make that robot back out of the way and then disable it. Gosh, I hope I never have to do that. That sounds kind of tricky to actually do. So hopefully that minor penalty will get people to knock it off. I have a comment from Kathy.
The issue is that preventing a robot from moving forward is not pinning if it can still move backward. That's the whole locked in all directions.
I see. So, okay, so, right, Kathy observes that stopping a robot from moving forward doesn't count pinning. You have to stop it from moving both forward and back. And so I think if we go back to my original statement, if a robot can only move forward and back, and you've blocked its forward direction and it's up against the wall in the backward direction, but it has clearance that if its drivetrain were capable to move sideways, then that's not pinning.
That is pinning.
Okay, we still have a controversy. I apologize for the craziness here, and we'll move on.
And then we have a question about deploying the ramp.
So we have a question.
For deploying the ramp, Beth mentions that there's a Q&A that talks about a detachable ramp, and that, you can't detach a ramp, but apparently you could have a string tied to it, but then you have to worry about entanglements.
I see. Okay, so Beth points out that you can't deploy a detachable ramp for the rule that we talked about earlier. You can have a detachable part. So you can't just flop down some ramp and then have the other robot drive on top of it if it's not still attached to the owning robot. So you could circumvent that by having a string tied to the ramp that you drop, but then you have an entanglement issue. So there's some funny edge cases, and I definitely recommend reading the Q&As to stay up to date on these, kind of odd cases that we may be seeing as teams, explore the edges of the rules. So Rule G11 says that the actions of one robot may not cause an opposing robot to incur a penalty. So that means if a blue robot drives over to a red robot and dumps a ring into the red robot in some inaccessible spot, causing it to now be carrying more than 2 rings, that penalty doesn't count. So it's as if that ring weren't there. Likewise, if a blue robot can't push a red robot into the blue ring dispenser and have the red robot get that giant penalty for touching a ring on the ring dispenser. The flip side of this rule is you can't exploit this rule. So for instance, if a blue robot were to push a red robot into the blue ring dispenser, as soon as the blue robot backs away, the red robot has to get out of there. It can't remain in contact with the illegal object. So you can't stay in an otherwise illegal position or condition just because somebody forced you there initially. As soon as they get out of your way, you have to clear that condition. G12 says that robots must be designed to permit easy removal of scoring elements from any grasping or containing mechanism. So there's a couple of times when that's important. At the end of autonomous, when I need to remove autonomous rings that are in contact with their robot, I need to be able to remove it without them, using power to open up a grasping hand or whatever. So basically the ref needs to be able to grab the ring and remove it from the robot easily. And then likewise at the end of the match when we're ready to do the field reset, we don't want to have to be in a position where the team has to get control of their robot to open up a grasping hand or something. So it's very important to keep the match schedule going, that we be able to do this. So if this happens, then we have to require the robot to either fix the problem or stop using that mechanism and pass inspection before playing again. Yeah, so the question is what happens if the offending robot?
Let's say the line contact, probably not two lines.
Okay, so let's,
Let me tell you, I'm going to unmute Scott Smith like you
okay, so Scott Smith has a question, and so we're going to unmute Scott. So Scott, can you tell us your question?
There we go. I had to unmute myself.
Sure.
So if a blue robot pushes a red robot into the blue dispenser and causes the red robot to be disabled at that point, are they still, obviously they can't now move away from it?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of questions you can ask along these lines, and it's maybe impossible to answer them with complete generality. But I would say in that case, that the red robot's not going to be racking up penalties if it can't move. So hopefully we won't see that happen. But yeah, the situation was created by the blue robot, and the red robot can't fix it either because the blue robot stayed there or because it unplugged red's power. Then red's not going to earn a penalty. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's see, so where are we at? Okay, so G13 says that during qualification matches, the red robot has the right to position their robots after blue's robots are placed. So what that means is that playing by the book, you have the blue alliance set up their robots, and then the red robots can set up the position of their robots and possibly in a way that reacts to the way the blue robots were placed. The teams are welcome to waive that requirement, and I don't know, I've reffed a lot of FTC matches, and this rarely comes into play. But if during the qualifying matches, and that's all the matches at the league events, if the red team wants to tweak their robot position after blue is set up, then they're allowed to do that. And then blue cannot adjust their robot position. When we get to having elimination matches, it isn't going to matter for a while, but I'll just tell you, the lower seeded alliance sets up first. So if you have the 5th seeded alliance playing against the 2nd seeded alliance, then the 5th seeded alliance sets up first, and then the alliance with the higher seeding gets to set up their robots in response. And teams that deliberately exploit this rule to delay the start of a match may be penalized or disqualified. So you can't goof around and try to delay the start of a match to help out a teammate or something. So yeah, people that mess with this rule get punished. G14, matches may be replayed at the discretion of the head ref when a game element fails in a consequential way. So if a peg falls off of the rack, but none of the robots were capable, let's say a peg falls off the top row of the rack, but none of the robots on the field are capable of scoring a ring on that top row of the rack, then we're not going to replay the match. It didn't have an effect on the outcome of the match. But if one that was holding some rings falls off, or falls off just as somebody was about to score onto it, then we'd want to get that fixed and replay the match. Another thing is if robots lose control because of a verifiable field failure that affects the game outcome. So again, it has to affect the game outcome, and it has to be verifiably a field failure. Now there are lots of things that will cause robots to lose power, it'll cause a driver to lose control of a robot briefly. For example, if a robot gets bumped, you can have a loose power connector that cuts off power to either the Samantha module or the NXT brick, and you'll lose power. You'll lose the communication. You won't be able to control the robot. That's not a field fault. That doesn't get the match replayed. And also some bricks, it's been found that after a few hours of play, sometimes the bricks just get tired and they'll start locking up. And hopefully the FTAs will have training on how to recognize that and be able to show the team, no, it's a problem with your brick, not a problem with the field. But if all of the robots lose control at the same time and that lasts for more than a few seconds, then we need to start looking to see what the problem with the field is and consider replaying a match. But one robot losing control for a few seconds is generally not a reason to replay a match. Even one robot losing control for the whole match isn't a problem unless we can show that it was a real field issue. G15 says at the end of autonomous, the head ref will, if needed, untangle robots, place robots on their drivetrain, and make any minor adjustments to robot position so that robots can participate in the driver-controlled period. So basically, yeah, you can have robots run amok and crazy stuff will happen. A robot might end up getting tipped over, or might have two robots tangled into each other, or two robots just get jammed into a position where neither of them can move. And in situations like that, we want the robots, we want to sort of take some of the risk out of being, brave enough and clever enough to have an autonomous mode on your robot. We don't want people to be punished for that. So we want to, take reasonable steps to make sure that they'll be able to participate. And if you do have to, turn a robot over or make a significant move, then you want to talk to the team, say, oh, where can I grab this robot so that I can safely lift it back onto its wheels? So obviously we don't want to ref to damage a robot while trying to fix it. G16 says, the field has tolerances. Things might be a little bigger or a little smaller than the official drawing specs. And basically G16 says there's no whining about that. If the rack is an extra quarter of an inch, if the pegs are a quarter of an inch higher off the floor than they're supposed to be, that's part of the game. But obviously, if the field's grossly out of spec or something's broken, then we want to make every effort to get the field fixed and keep it in regulation shape during the entire event. G17. This is the big hammer. This is how we enforce the notion of gracious professionalism. So if we have either robot actions or team member behavior that is wildly inappropriate, then the ref has the right to disqualify the team, to assess a major penalty of 50 points, and even disqualify them from the event. So examples of that might be, for example, a team member swearing at the ref, or at an opposing team, or even at one driver, behaving badly to another one, yelling at them, kicking the field, any sort of, really unsportsmanlike conduct, anything that's really neither gracious nor professional. If it's sufficiently egregious, then the ref has G17 as a way to eliminate that behavior. And that concludes our trip through all of the rules, and now I'll take any questions you might have. So if you have a question, either type it in or raise your hand. Okay, so Randy, we'll unmute you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we got a league with 11 teams, and 8 of them are rookies. Some of them haven't even have field setups. So what happens if we have robots that are substantially non-operative? Do you say you put your non-operative robot on the field, or do you substitute for another robot to make the gameplay more interesting? Or
nah, the team can only play their robot. So yeah, if they have to put a non-operative robot on the field, then yeah, that's what they should do.
What if they choose to withdraw or have no-shows?
If they have no-shows, then they're disqualified from the match, and they don't earn the qualifying points. Right, so you get a qualifying point.
Continue the match with just one robot then?
Yeah,
well,
yeah, sure.
And Tom, question, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, when teams check in, we'll put them into the scoring software so that if there's a team that's a no-show, they won't be put into the match schedule initially. Is that correct? Or is that a
Yeah.
question for Leo on Monday? But that's my understanding is as teams as part of the check-in process, they'll go into the scoring system. So if a team misses a match for a broken robot, that's one thing. But if a team is a no-show, they won't be in the schedule at all.
Absolutely, that's right. Yep. And so if a team shows up and they have a robot that doesn't work and it just sits there on the field and it's a lump, well, they can still earn qualifying points. You know, if their alliance partner is good enough to win the match on their own, then they'll get points for a win or a tie. And yeah, that's the way the game's played. Hopefully the veteran teams will help non-functional rookie teams get their robots working. But yeah, if they show up with a non-functioning robot, then that's what you get. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Anyone else? Adrian, did we talk about, I mentioned the scheduling and using the doodle. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with regards to that?
No, not that I can think of. I'll send an email out. You know, with events next Friday and Saturday, we really need to figure out, you know, where we have refs and if we have any holes. So when we send that email out, I guess I would ask that everybody please sign up and let me know your availability so we can contact you right away and make sure that we have enough volunteers for our league events, especially for the first events. I know it's going to be a little bit tough. So we want to try and make sure that we have plenty of people for those events.
Okay, great. So also after the webinar's done, I've got the ref certification test ready to roll. So I'll send everybody a piece of email that'll have a personalized link that'll let you take the test. And I think the test is pretty self-explanatory. If you get a question right, then you get the points for it. If you get a question wrong, then it'll give you an opportunity to answer it again. And so hopefully it'll be, you know, partly a test of what you know, and also, you know, a little guided reading to make sure that you're up to speed on the most important rules. If you have any, you know, questions or problems with the test, send me a piece of email and we'll get that straightened out. But I hope that will be, you know, fairly straightforward and educational and not annoying. But it's the first time we've done this, so I hope that works out well. And right, Kathy points out that mail will also have a link to the resources page that I kept referring to, and Kathy and I'll arm wrestle on that pinning question that we had. So do you have any other questions that have popped up? Well, I think we're done there. Thanks to everyone for showing up. I know this is a big chunk of the evening that we spent doing this, and obviously the job that you'll be doing is incredibly important. It would not be possible to run these matches without having well-qualified referees, so I really appreciate you taking the time not only to do the training and to read the rules and take the test, but also especially for agreeing to come and officiate these matches. It's very important to these students, and I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, and I'll call it good night.